The dust had not yet settled on the road when the rider pulled his horse to an abrupt, skidding stop, the animal's hooves churning red earth into a small cloud that drifted lazily across the afternoon sun. He had come fast, that much was obvious. His horse was lathered, his coat was thick with trail dust, and his eyes carried the particular shine of a man who believed he held leverage. He was wrong. Standing at the gate of the Townsend property, one hand resting on the worn grip of a Colt single-action Army revolver and both boots planted wide in the dirt, was Lionel Abbott. He did not move when the rider came barreling down the road. He did not step aside when the horse nearly ran him over. He simply stood there, jaw set, dark eyes fixed on the man with the kind of absolute, unblinking stillness that told every soul who had ever crossed his path that the calm was not the absence of danger. It was the danger. "Turn that horse around," Lionel said, his voice low and unhurried and carrying the weight of a man who had never once needed to raise it. "She is not receiving company today." The rider, a man by the name of Chester Hollies, reined in his horse with a jerk that made the animal toss its head. Chester was broad through the shoulders and wore a smirk that he had been told was charming. That smirk had worked on a great many women. It did not appear to be working presently. "That's so?" Chester said, looking past Lionel toward the white-painted house at the end of the long gravel path. "Because I got a legal document signed by Judge Harlan Fitch himself that says Miss Beatrice Townsend owes my employer $5,200 and I intend to collect on it." "Then you can ride that document back to Judge Fitch and tell him to mail it," Lionel said. "And who in the devil are you?" Chester demanded. Lionel did not answer that question. He simply let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable, and then he let it stretch a little more. His hand did not leave the revolver. Chester Hollies stared at him for a long, measuring moment. Then he looked at the revolver. Then he looked at Lionel's eyes. Something in what he found there made the smirk soften at the edges. He wheeled his horse around without another word and rode back the way he had come, fast. Lionel watched until the rider was a small, retreating shape against the flat amber horizon. Then he turned and walked back up the gravel path toward the house. He had not always been the kind of man who stood at gates defending women he barely knew. Once, not so long ago, he had been a different kind of man entirely. The story of how he came to be standing in the dry Texas heat in the year 1882, protecting a woman named Beatrice Townsend from the men her late father had left in his debts, was the kind of story that did not begin with heroism. It began, as most true things do, with desperation. 6 weeks earlier, Lionel Abbott had ridden into the town of Caldwell Creek, Texas, on a Wednesday afternoon in late August, with $11 in his pocket, a reputation he could not outrun, and no particular destination in mind. He had been riding without direction since he left New Mexico in the spring, and direction had not improved him. He had done things in New Mexico that he preferred not to examine in daylight. He had worked as a deputy marshal in a town called Tres Rios, and when the marshal himself had proven to be the one stealing cattle from local ranchers and selling them across the border, Lionel had been the one to stand up in the street and say so. The marshal had not taken that well. There had been a confrontation. The marshal was still alive, which was something Lionel had made certain of, because he was not a killer by preference, though the reputation that followed him suggested otherwise. The story had gotten twisted in the telling, the way all stories did west of the Mississippi. By the time it reached Caldwell Creek, it had become a tale of Lionel Abbott, fastest gun in 3 territories, who had shot down 4 men in the span of an afternoon. None of that was true. The truth was quieter and more complicated, the way truth almost always was. He rode into Caldwell Creek and tied his horse, a brown gelding named Samuel, at the post outside the Crescent Moon Saloon. He was thinking about a cold beer and a warm meal, and possibly a room for the night if the $11 would stretch that far. He was not thinking about debt collectors or grieving daughters or the way fate, sometimes lined up a man's path the moment he least expected it. The Crescent Moon Saloon was loud and smoky, with 3 men playing cards in the corner, a piano player working through something approximating a waltz, and a barkeeper with enormous mustaches who looked at Lionel's dusty coat and gun belt with the particular assessment of a man who had learned to identify trouble at first glance. "Beer," Lionel said, taking a stool at the far end of the bar where he could see the door. The barkeeper set a glass in front of him. "You passing through or you looking for work?" "Depends on the work," Lionel said. That was how it always started. Before the barkeeper could elaborate, the door of the saloon swung open, and a woman walked in who did not belong there, and everyone in the room knew it immediately. She was tall, with dark hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed hat that had seen better days, wearing a practical cotton dress that was dusty at the hem from what looked like a long walk. She had a posture that suggested she had been raised to hold herself straight regardless of what was happening around her, and what was happening around her at the moment was clearly considerable. Her eyes swept the room with a kind of desperate efficiency, landing briefly on each face before moving to the next. They landed on the barkeeper. "Mr. Dolly," she said, walking to the bar with purpose. "I need to speak with you about my father's account." The barkeeper, who was evidently Mr. Dolly, developed a sudden interest in polishing glasses. "Miss Townsend, I told you already. The account was settled when my father settled nothing," she said, and her voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it that reminded Lionel of a blade. "He died 3 weeks ago, and since then I have had 3 different men come to my property claiming debts I have never heard of. I would like to understand who he owed and how much, because I am getting the strong impression that a great many people in this town believe I am an easy mark." "Now, Miss Townsend, nobody thinks I am not finished," she said. "My name is Beatrice Townsend. My father was Gerald Townsend, who ran the Townsend Cattle Ranch east of town for 22 years. He was not a foolish man and he was not a dishonest one, and I will not sit quietly in that house while strangers come to my door waving papers at me. I need to know who authorized those documents, and I need to know today." The piano had stopped. Everyone in the saloon was watching her. She appeared not to notice, or perhaps not to care. Mr. Dolly leaned across the bar and dropped his voice. "Miss Townsend, the man behind those documents is Randall Cook. You know who that is." The name did something to her face, something brief and involuntary, a flicker of fear she controlled almost immediately. "Randall Cook," she repeated. "He's been buying up debts all over the county," Dolly said. "Your father borrowed against the ranch 2 years ago to get through the drought. Cook bought that debt from the bank in January. He's been waiting for the right moment." Beatrice Townsend stood very still for a moment. Then she said, "How much time do I have?" "His man comes back Thursday," Dolly said. "That's tomorrow." She turned from the bar without another word, and Lionel watched her walk to the door. She had not solved anything. She had confirmed that everything was worse than she had thought, and she walked out with the same straight spine she had walked in with, because she was not the kind of woman who let a room full of strangers watch her fall apart. Lionel finished his beer. He did not know why he stood up. He genuinely could not have explained it to anyone, including himself. He left a coin on the bar and walked out after her. She was standing on the boardwalk, looking at the street with her jaw set and her hands clasped in front of her, and for a single moment before she heard him behind her, he could see what the rigid posture was containing. It was pure, exhausted fear. "Ma'am," he said. She turned and the mask was back instantly. "Can I help you?" "I don't know," he said honestly, "but I overheard what you said in there about Randall Cook." Her eyes narrowed. "Are you one of his men?" "No, ma'am." "Then why are you talking to me?" He took his hat off and turned it in his hands, which was something he rarely did. "I heard you're expecting a man tomorrow. I thought maybe you could use someone at your gate." She stared at him. "I don't know you." "That's true. I don't have money to pay a guard. I didn't ask for any." She continued to stare at him with a directness that made most people uncomfortable and seemed to be one of her natural weapons. Why would you do that for a stranger? Lionel thought about it. Because you walked into that saloon by yourself and said what needed saying, and nobody in there was going to stand up and help you, and I think you deserve better than that." There was a long pause. Behind them, a wagon rolled through the street, raising more dust. A dog barked somewhere in the middle distance. "My name is Beatrice Townsend," she said finally. "Lionel Abbott." Something moved across her face when he said the name. She had heard it before. Almost everyone had, though never accurately. "The Gunslinger, the former deputy marshal," he said carefully. She looked at him for another long moment, and Lionel had the distinct impression that she was running some kind of internal calculation that had nothing to do with sentimentality and everything to do with survival. "I will accept your offer," she said, "but I want to be clear about something. I will not be managed, advised, or patronized on my own property. If you are at that gate, you are there as a guard, not a guardian. Those are very different things." "Yes, ma'am," he said. "I understand the difference." She gave a single, decisive nod. "You can sleep in the barn. There is a room above the stable with a cot. I will provide breakfast." "That is more than generous." "It is," she agreed, completely without irony, and started walking. He followed her, leading Samuel, and that was how it began. The Townsend Ranch was about a mile east of town, set back from the road behind a line of cottonwood trees that were beginning to show the first suggestion of autumn yellow. The house itself was solid and well built, a two-story white clapboard structure with a wide front porch and a garden along the south side that was doing its best in the August heat. There was a barn, a stable, a smokehouse, and a chicken coop, and the whole property had the look of something that had once been tended with great care, and was now being maintained by someone who had taken on more than one person could reasonably manage. Beatrice showed him the room above the stable without ceremony. It was clean, which surprised him. There was a cot with a wool blanket, a washstand, and a small window that looked out over the road. Everything a man needed and nothing he did not. "Breakfast is at 6, she said from the doorway. "Supper at 7 in the evening. I do not expect conversation at meals. I do not expect to be thanked. I expect you to do what you said you would do." "You'll have it," he said. She left. He sat on the edge of the cot and listened to her footsteps descend the stairs, then cross the yard, then climb the porch steps of the house. A door closed. He looked at the ceiling for a while. He had seen a great many people in difficult circumstances. He had seen them crumble and rage and collapse inward, and occasionally he had seen them hold. Beatrice Townsend held in a way that made him think of something structural, like a bridge or a wall, things that were designed to bear tremendous weight and show nothing of the strain. He suspected that was not entirely healthy, but it was impressive, and it had been a long time since anything had impressed him. He took off his boots and lay down on the cot and was asleep in minutes. He woke at 5, as he always did, old habit from years of keeping early watches. He washed his face, checked his revolver from force of habit rather than expectation, and went down to the yard. The sky was still gray and cool, and the first birds were beginning their conversation in the cottonwoods. He walked the perimeter of the property slowly, getting familiar with it the way you did a space you might someday need to defend. By the time he came back around to the gate, there was smoke coming from the kitchen chimney. Breakfast was biscuits, salt pork, and coffee so strong it was nearly solid, served at a plain wooden table in a kitchen that smelled of wood smoke and dried herbs. Beatrice sat across from him and looked at the window rather than at him, and true to her word, she did not make conversation. He ate and drank and looked at his plate and thought that the silence was actually not unpleasant. "Chester Hollies will be the one who comes," she said, when the biscuits were gone. "He is Randall Cook's primary collector. He is not violent by nature, but he is aggressive, and he is accustomed to people being afraid of him." "All right," Lionel said. "I want him turned away cleanly. No confrontation beyond what is necessary." "Understood." She looked at him directly for the first time since the boardwalk. "You are not what I expected," she said. It was not entirely a compliment and not entirely otherwise. "People rarely are," he said. She almost smiled. It was very slight and brief, a small movement at the corner of her mouth that she seemed to close down deliberately, but he saw it. He cataloged it without examining why he was cataloging it. Chester Hollies arrived in the early afternoon, which was how Lionel had come to be standing at the gate with his hand on the colt. And when Chester Hollies turned his horse and rode away, Lionel walked back up the path and found Beatrice standing on the porch with her arms crossed, having watched the whole exchange from the house. "He'll be back," she said. "Yes," Lionel agreed. "With Cook himself, most likely." She descended the porch steps and came to stand beside him, looking down the road where Chester Hollies had disappeared into the distance. This close, he was aware of the slight tremble she was controlling in her hands, the way she kept her jaw firm against it. "My father was a good man," she said, which was not what he had expected her to say. "He was not a businessman. He was a rancher and he was good at that, but the drought nearly broke him, and when the bank offered that loan he took it without understanding the terms properly. Randall Cook was on the board of that bank. He helped structure those terms. He knew exactly what would happen if the drought continued." "That is a dark past for a man in a respectable position," Lionel said. "Cook has a great many dark things in his history," she said. "He owns half this county and he is working on the other half. My father's land is the piece that connects two sections of Cook's holdings. That is why he is so eager. You've done your homework." "I have had 3 weeks to do nothing but think," she said. There was something in her voice then, something underneath the practicality, a note of raw grief that she was clearly not accustomed to allowing out. She caught it herself and straightened. "I will not lose this ranch. My father built it over 20 years. It is not going to Randall Cook." "Then we need to understand exactly what legal ground you're standing on," Lionel said. "Is there an attorney in Caldwell Creek? James Whitfield. He's honest, which is rare enough. He represented my father on some land matters years ago." "Talk to him today," Lionel said. "If Cook has Judge Fitch behind him, you need your own legal voice and you need it fast." She looked at him. "You know something about the law. I was a deputy marshal for 4 years. Why aren't you one anymore?" He had known the question was coming, but he had not quite decided how to answer it. He chose something that was true without being complete. "I made an enemy of the wrong man, the kind of man who could make the job disappear." She considered that. "That is very nearly a full answer," she said. "It's the one I have today," he said. She nodded slowly. "I'll ride into town this afternoon and speak with Whitfield. Will you be here?" "I'll be here," he said. She went in to put on her riding hat, and Lionel stood in the yard in the late August sun and wondered what exactly he had walked into and why it felt, for the first time in a very long while, like somewhere he might want to stay. The conversation with James Whitfield, which Beatrice relayed to Lionel that evening over a supper of dried beans and cornbread, was not encouraging, but it was not hopeless. The debt was legitimate, Whitfield had confirmed. Gerald Townsend had indeed borrowed $4,000 from the First Caldwell Bank in 1880. The terms had included a clause that allowed the holder of the debt to demand full repayment with 18 months of accumulated interest if the borrower died before the loan was retired. That interest had elevated the total to $5,200. Cook held the debt legally. What Cook did not legally hold was the right to the land itself, without first going through a formal foreclosure process in the county court, which would take a minimum of 60 days, and required a judge other than Harlan Fitch, who had recused himself from Townsend matters on the advice of his own lawyer after someone had apparently pointed out that his relationship with Randall Cook was perhaps too cozy for judicial impartiality. "That gives us 60 days, Lionel said. "Whitfield thinks it gives us 45 realistically," Beatrice said. "Cook will find ways to accelerate the process." "What is the ranch worth?" "The land alone at current prices is worth approximately $8,000. The cattle, the buildings, the water rights closer to $12,000. "And what liquid assets do you have?" She was quiet for a moment. He had come to understand that her silences were not evasions. They were assessments. She was deciding how much to trust him every single time and making the decision fresh. "After my father's funeral expenses, I have $64. He did not react visibly, which she seemed to appreciate. "What about the cattle?" 38 head, but selling them now in September with no trail drive arranged, I would get next to nothing. There is a cattle broker in San Antonio, he said. Man named Emmett Voss. He buys small lots late season. The price will not be good, but it will be better than nothing. She looked at him. How do you know Emmett Voss? I drove cattle for 3 seasons before I took the deputy position. Voss was a fair dealer. Something shifted in her expression, very slightly, as if she had revised some internal estimate upward. You have done a great deal of different things, she said. I have gone where the work was, he said. That's all. They sat with that for a moment. The oil lamp between them threw warm light, and outside the window the Texas night had settled in cool and enormous, thick with stars. A coyote called somewhere in the distance and was answered by another further away. You could write to Voss, Lionel said. Describe the cattle and ask for a price. If it's sufficient, you could sell, and that would eliminate the immediate cash problem. It would not eliminate Cook, she said. No, he agreed, but it would take away his most urgent lever. A man who can pay his debts is harder to pressure than a man who cannot. She sat with both hands wrapped around her coffee cup and thought about it. He watched her think. It was, he was realizing, one of the more interesting things he had encountered in some time, watching this woman's mind work. She was genuinely sharp, not in the decorative way that people sometimes complimented as a means of expressing surprise, but in a structural way, the kind of intelligence that built things. I'll write to Voss in the morning, she said. Good. She stood to clear the dishes, and he stood too, which made her pause and look at him with a slightly uncertain expression, as if she was not sure whether to be grateful or offended. He was simply raised to stand when a woman did, a habit from a childhood in Kentucky that he had never quite shaken. Good night, Mr. Abbott, she said. Good night, Miss Townsend. He went out across the yard to the stable, and she washed the dishes alone in the lamplight, and neither of them acknowledged the peculiar domesticity of the arrangement they had fallen into, because there was no reasonable framework within which to acknowledge it. Randall Cook arrived himself 4 days later, which was faster than either of them had expected. He came in a black buggy with 2 outriders, and he was dressed in a dark suit that had been made somewhere back east. He was perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair and a face that bore the careful composure of a man who had spent many years learning to smile while meaning something else entirely. Lionel was at the gate. Cook leaned out of the buggy and regarded him with the mild interest of a man who had seen many things and found very few of them surprising. You must be Lionel Abbott, he said. And you must be Randall Cook, Lionel said. I have an appointment with Miss Townsend. She is not expecting you, Lionel said. If you want to call on her, you should write ahead. That's the correct procedure. Cook smiled, and the smile was the most dangerous thing about him. Son, I hold paper on this property. I have a legal right, you have a legal right to begin a foreclosure proceeding in county court, Lionel said pleasantly, which I am told your attorney has already done. That process takes 60 days. Until it concludes, Miss Townsend is the legal owner of this property, and she decides who comes through that gate. Today she is not receiving company. One of the outriders shifted in his saddle. Lionel's attention moved to the man briefly, just briefly, but the quality of that attention apparently communicated something, because the outrider settled again. Cook looked at Lionel for a long moment. The smile did not waver, but something behind his eyes did, something recalculated. She's got you convinced she's the wronged party in this, Cook said. She's not. Her father borrowed money and didn't repay it. That's a simple transaction. Then let the court settle it, Lionel said. Cook sat back in the buggy. I'll be back, he said, with the kind of certainty that was meant to feel like a threat. Right ahead, Lionel said. The buggy turned around. Lionel watched it go. When he turned back to the house, he found Beatrice on the porch again. She had been watching from the moment they arrived. Her face was pale under the sun, but her expression was composed, and she gave him a single nod that said more than most speeches. He nodded back and went to check on Samuel. That evening, she did something she had not done before. She came out to the stable while he was grooming the horse, which was a task he found meditative, and she sat on a hay bale not far from where he was working, and she said, "Tell me about New Mexico." He kept brushing Samuel's flank. The horse huffed contentedly. "What do you want to know? What happened there? The real version, not the one people tell." He had not told anyone the real version, partly because it reflected on a federal marshal, and partly because he was not sure who would believe it. But she was looking at him in a way that was direct and quiet and entirely without judgment, and the space between them felt, in a way he could not quite articulate, like a confessional. He told her about Tres Rios. He told her about Marshal Darrell Vance, who had been charismatic and connected, and who had been stealing cattle from local Tejano ranchers and selling them to buyers in El Paso. He told her about the months of watching and cataloging evidence, the hidden motive behind Vance's friendliness with certain buyers, the trap Vance had tried to set for him when the evidence became too clear to ignore. He told her about the confrontation in the street and how it had looked to bystanders, and how it had been reported, and how that reporting had made him something he was not. She listened without interrupting. When he was finished, she was quiet for a while. "The ranchers who were stolen from," she said, "were they compensated?" "Not officially," he said. "I turned the evidence over to the territorial court, and I have been told the case is ongoing." "That may mean something, or it may mean nothing." "That angers you," she said, "not a question." "There is injustice in a great deal of what happens in this territory," he said, "and there are very few systems in place to address it, and the ones that exist are regularly captured by men like Vance and men like Cook. So yes, it angers me." She nodded slowly. "My father," she said, "gave water rights to the Cimarron family for 20 years. They are a Tejano family who have been on the land east of us since before Texas was Texas. When the bank crisis came, the new bank board tried to revoke those water rights as part of their debt consolidation. My father went to court himself and testified in the Cimarron family's defense. It cost him considerable goodwill with the bank board." "Which was Cook's board?" Lionel said. "Which was Cook's board," she confirmed. "So you see, this is not entirely about money. Cook dislikes our family on principle." They looked at each other in the warm golden light of the stable, surrounded by the smell of hay and horse and the soft sound of Samuel working his teeth on something. And Lionel felt something that he recognized with considerable unease as the early stages of genuine feeling. Not admiration, which was simpler and more manageable. Something warmer and more inconvenient than admiration. He looked away first. "You should get some rest," he said. "Tomorrow I thought I would ride into town and talk to Whitfield myself. There may be something in the original loan documents that Cook's attorney missed. Lenders sometimes make mistakes in the paperwork, and if the terms weren't properly disclosed under Texas statute, you know Texas debt law," she said. "I know enough to know what questions to ask," he said. She stood up from the hay bale and brushed down her skirt. She was close enough that he could see the fine detail of her expression, and what he saw there was something complex, a feeling she was turning over and not quite ready to name, something that looked very much like what he was attempting not to feel himself. "Good night, Mr. Abbott," she said softly. "Good night, Miss Townsend," he said. She walked back across the moonlit yard, and he stood in the stable doorway and watched her until she was inside the house, and then he stood there a while longer because there was no good reason not to. The next morning, Lionel rode into Caldwell Creek and spent 3 hours with James Whitfield, going through the loan documentation line by line. Whitfield was a thin, dry, precise man in his early 50s who had the careful eyes of someone who had found many devils in many details, and he watched Lionel read through the documents with the attentive expression of a man reassessing a stranger. "You were a lawman," Whitfield said, around the second hour. "Deputy marshal, yes. That explains the questions." Whitfield pulled at his collar. "Abbott, there is something in those documents I've been sitting on because I was not certain of the statute. Look at Clause 7, subsection B." Lionel found it and read it twice. Then he read it again. The clause stipulated that the death acceleration provision was only valid if the borrower had been given written notice of that provision in a separate disclosure document signed no less than 90 days prior to the origination of the loan. It was a relatively new requirement, codified in Texas banking statute in 1879, and it was the kind of technical compliance item that smaller county banks frequently overlooked. Was the disclosure document in the file? Lionel asked. That, Whitfield said, is what I was not certain about. I requested a complete file copy from the bank last week. It arrived yesterday. He opened a separate folder and laid it on the desk between them. The disclosure document was not there. Lionel looked at the empty space where it should have been for a long moment. Without that disclosure, the death acceleration clause is unenforceable. That is my reading of the statute, Whitfield said, which means the only debt Miss Townsend owes is the original loan amount and standard interest, which by my calculation is approximately $4,600. No death acceleration, no inflated total. And she has the full original loan term remaining, which does not expire until March of 1884. Lionel sat back in his chair and let out a slow breath. Does Cook know this? I believe he suspects there may be a technical issue, Whitfield said carefully, which may be why he is moving so aggressively. He wants a settlement before anyone looks too closely. Can you file a motion with the county court today? I already have the papers drafted, Whitfield said, and allowed himself a small, dry smile. Lionel rode back to the ranch faster than he had ridden out, and when he came through the gate and up the path and swung off Samuel in the yard, Beatrice came out of the house at the sound of the hooves, wiping her hands on a cloth, and looked at his face. "What happened?" she said. He told her. She listened with the same complete attention she brought to everything, standing very still in the yard with the afternoon sun on her face and the cloth forgotten in her hands. When he finished, she said nothing for almost a full minute. Then she sat down on the porch steps, which he had not seen her do before. She sat down rather heavily, and she put her face in her hands, and he understood that what was happening was not collapse but release, the particular kind of unwinding that comes when you have been holding something enormous at enormous effort for a very long time, and someone tells you that you can put it down. He sat beside her on the steps at a careful and respectful distance, and he did not say anything because nothing needed to be said. After a while she took her hands from her face. Her eyes were dry but very bright. "This is not over," she said. "No," he agreed. "Cook will fight it, but you have ground to stand on now." She turned and looked at him, and the look was different from the measuring assessments he was used to receiving from her. This one was open in a way that he suspected she had not intended. "Mr. Abbott," she said, "why are you doing this?" "I told you on the boardwalk. You told me a reason," she said. "I want to know the real reason." He thought about it. He thought about it honestly, which was unusual. "Because you reminded me of something I had forgotten," he said finally. "That it is possible to stand up for what's right not because someone is paying you to and not because it's your official duty, just because it's the right thing to do. I needed reminding of that." She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. "That is a real answer," she said. "It's the one I have today," he said, and echoed her own words back to her deliberately. The corner of her mouth moved, not a near smile this time. An actual one, small and careful and completely genuine, and it did something to the center of his chest that he could not attribute to the afternoon heat. "I believe you are hungry," she said, "and I have a chicken that needs dealing with." "I'll deal with it," he said, and stood up. "You cook." She stood too, looking at him with an expression that suggested she was revising several assumptions simultaneously. "I cook well enough not to poison myself," he said. "Which is the relevant standard when you're on the trail." "By all means," she said, and opened the kitchen door for him. They cooked supper together that evening for the first time, moving around each other in the small kitchen, with the particular careful choreography of two people in close quarters who are trying very hard not to touch each other accidentally and occasionally failing anyway. And when his hand brushed hers reaching for the salt and they both went very still for a fraction of a second, and then both pretended it had not happened. The pretense was not entirely convincing. Supper was very good. The conversation was better. She told him about growing up on the ranch, the only child of Gerald and Martha Townsend, her mother having died of fever when Beatrice was 9. She told him about learning to ride before she could read, about cattle drives with her father when she was old enough, about the winter she was 14 when a blizzard killed 30 head and her father had gone very quiet for a long time, the way strong men go quiet when something has shaken the foundations of their confidence. He told her about growing up in Kentucky, about his father's farm and his mother's violin and his older brother Thomas, who had gone to fight in the war between the states and come back altered in ways the family had never entirely understood or recovered from. He told her about leaving Kentucky at 17 because the farm and the altered brother and the weight of everything that had happened were too much to carry in such a small space, and how the West had felt when he first rode into it, like the best possible answer to a question he had not known he was asking. They talked through supper and into the evening, and when the lamp burned low and neither of them had noticed the time passing, Beatrice looked at the window and saw the dark and said, with what sounded like genuine surprise, "It's late." "It is," he said. They sat with that for a moment. "I have not talked this much in 3 weeks," she said. "Perhaps longer." "Grief is quiet work," he said. She nodded, looking at the lamp. "I miss him," she said. "I am angry at him too, a little, for the debt and the secrecy around it, but mostly I miss him." "That's a natural thing to feel," he said, "both of those things at once." "Is it?" She seemed genuinely uncertain. "In my experience," he said, "people are complicated and love is complicated and grief is the most complicated of all. It contains everything." She looked at him, and the lamplight was very warm and her eyes were dark and clear. "You are a surprising man, Mr. Abbott," she said. "I am frequently told I am not what people expected," he said. "People are frequently not paying enough attention," she said. It was the most personal thing she had said to him, and he understood it as the thing it was, which was an acknowledgment that she was paying attention, had been from the beginning. He felt the weight of that acknowledgment and met it. "Good night, Miss Townsend," he said softly. "Good night, Mr. Abbott," she said, equally softly. He went out across the yard in the dark, and this time he did not look back, because he was afraid that if he did, he would see her watching from the doorway, and he was not entirely sure what he would do with that information. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself that neither of them planned and neither of them discussed. He was at the gate in the mornings. She brought coffee out to him, always at 7, in a blue enamel cup. Supper was increasingly a shared endeavor. Evenings stretched longer than they needed to. The distance he kept in physical space became something that required more conscious maintenance than it had at the beginning, because proximity had a way of reframing distance, making it feel simultaneously more necessary and more artificial. They went together to the county court when Whitfield filed the motion. Cook's attorney, a sharp-faced man named Pryor, argued vigorously that the disclosure requirement was a technical formality that had been substantially complied with. Whitfield countered that the statute was explicit and that substantial compliance was not a standard Texas banking law recognized. The presiding judge, a bald and methodical man named Samuel Crane, who appeared entirely unimpressed by either attorney, took the matter under advisement and scheduled a hearing for October 5th. "That's 3 weeks," Beatrice said as they walked out of the courthouse. "3 weeks is manageable," Lionel said. "Cook will not wait 3 weeks sitting still," she said. She was right. On the following Monday, 2 of Cook's men rode slowly past the ranch property in the late afternoon. They did not stop. They simply rode by, slowly and visibly, in the manner of men who want to be seen. Lionel watched them from the gate without reaction. On Wednesday, a man from town came out to tell Beatrice that he had heard the feed merchant would no longer extend her credit, which was something Cook could have arranged with one conversation. On Friday, Someone left a dead coyote at the gate in the night, which was the kind of message that required no translation. Lionel removed the coyote before Beatrice saw it. He was not certain she would not have simply dealt with it practically herself, but he preferred that she not have to. That evening he came in for supper and she looked at his face and said, "What is happening?" It was not quite a question. He sat down and told her about the coyote. She was quiet for a moment. "He is trying to frighten me," she said. "Yes." "It is working," she said, and the honesty of it was so unexpected that he blinked. "Not enough to change anything." "But I would be a fool to claim I am not afraid." "You would be a fool to not be afraid," he said. "Cook is a dangerous man." "Are you afraid?" she asked. He thought about it. "Not for myself," he said. "For you." She looked at him across the table and something in the air between them shifted, quietly and permanently, the way the air shifts at the moment a season turns. They had both been aware of the feeling that had been building in the space between them, and they had both been carefully stepping around it. And now it was simply there, acknowledged by the acknowledging of it, present in the room with them like a third person. "Lionel," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name. "Beatrice," he said. They sat with their names in the air between them, and it was enough. For that evening it was enough. The night before the October 5th hearing, something happened that neither of them had anticipated, which in retrospect they both admitted they should have. Lionel was doing his nightly check of the property perimeter when he found the stable door open. He was certain he had closed it. He drew his revolver and went in quietly, and in the far stall he found a man trying to saddle Samuel. The man was young, perhaps 20, and frightened, and he had the look of someone who had not thought further ahead than the current task. When he saw Lionel and the revolver, he put his hands up immediately. I was told to just take the horse," he said. "I don't want any trouble." "Who told you?" Lionel said. The young man swallowed. "Foreman at the Double C," he said. The Double C was one of Cook's ranching operations. "What's your name?" Lionel said. "Billy Ames." "Billy Ames, I am going to tell you something and I want you to listen carefully. I am going to let you walk out of this stable. But you are going to tell your foreman and you are going to tell Randall Cook that there is nothing on this property that will be taken without a legal order from a judge. Not the horse, not the cattle, not a single fence post. You understand?" Billy Ames understood, judging by how fast he left. Lionel secured the stable and went back to his room and sat on the cot with his revolver on the washstand and thought about escalation and what it meant. Cook was growing impatient. The legal process was not going his way, and he was resorting to pressure tactics that were getting progressively less subtle. That was actually, in one sense, good news because it suggested he was worried. Worried men made mistakes. In the morning, Lionel told Beatrice. He told her all of it, including the part he had considered not telling her, that he had let the young man go. "You made the right decision," she said immediately. "He committed theft," Lionel said. "He was a young man following orders from someone more powerful than him," she said. "That is a very different thing." She paused. "Was he badly frightened?" "Very." "Good," she said. "Let him go home and think about who he is choosing to work for." They rode to town together for the hearing, Beatrice on her father's chestnut mare and Lionel on Samuel, and the ride through the early October morning was cool and bright, the cottonwoods fully golden now, the sky a particular shade of deep blue that only came in autumn in the hill country. They did not talk much. They did not need to. There was a companionship between them by now that had nothing to do with conversation. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Whitfield argued brilliantly, and Pryor argued skillfully, and Judge Crane listened to all of it with the same methodical, unhurried attention he had displayed at the first meeting. Then he recessed for 30 minutes, which felt like substantially longer, and came back and read his ruling. The disclosure requirement had not been met. The death acceleration clause was unenforceable. The debt reverted to its original terms and schedule. Miss Beatrice Townsend was under no obligation to pay the inflated amount, and the foreclosure proceeding was dismissed. Pryor stood up to object and Judge Crane looked at him over his glasses with an expression that closed that conversation without a word. Outside the courthouse in the bright October morning, Beatrice stood on the steps and looked out at the street and breathed. Lionel stood beside her. "It's not finished," she said after a while. "No," he said. "Cook can appeal. He can find other means of pressure. He will not simply accept this." "I know," she said. She turned and looked at him, and in the bright daylight her eyes were a shade of brown so warm it was almost amber. "But today it is enough. Today it is more than enough," he said. She did something then that surprised him entirely. She took his hand, briefly and firmly, and held it for just a moment and then let go. It was not romantic in any elaborate sense. It was simply the gesture of one person to another at a moment of shared relief, but his hand felt the warmth of it for the whole ride back. That evening she made a pot roast that used the last of the pepper she had been rationing, and she brought out a bottle of her father's whiskey that had been sitting in the kitchen cabinet since before he died, and she poured 2 glasses and set one in front of him without comment. He raised the glass. She raised hers. They drank. "I need to say something to you," she said. "And I am going to say it directly because that is how I am." "I would expect nothing else," he said. She met his eyes. "I am aware that what has developed between us over the past weeks is something beyond employment and beyond a simple transaction of kindness. I am aware that I have come to depend on you in ways that I have been careful for most of my life to depend on no one. And I am aware that you will, at some point, need to decide whether you are staying or leaving, and I would rather know the answer to that question than live inside the uncertainty of it." He was quiet for a moment, not because he was uncertain, but because the honesty of it deserved a considered response. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "That is not a simple answer, because I am aware that my presence here has complicated your life in ways that may not be evident yet. There are people who will use my reputation against you. There are people who will assume things about this arrangement that are not accurate. And Cook may find a way to connect me to something in my past in New Mexico that could be made to look damaging." He paused. "But none of that changes the fact that I am not going anywhere." She looked at him steadily. "Are you telling me that you want to stay because you care for this property?" "I am telling you," he said, "that I am staying because of you." The room was very quiet. The pot roast sat between them steaming, entirely forgotten. "That is the most direct thing you have said to me," she observed. "You inspire directness," he said. She stood up from her chair, which was not what he expected, and she walked around the table to him, and she stood in front of him, and she looked down at him with those amber eyes, and then she said, "Stand up, Lionel." He stood. They were very close. Close enough that he could see the small scar at her temple from where she had fallen from a horse at 14, which she had mentioned once in passing. Close enough that he was aware of every detail of her face, which he had apparently been memorizing without fully acknowledging the activity. She put one hand against his jaw lightly and looked at him as if confirming something she had been considering for a long time. He put his hand over hers, very gently. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. When he kissed her, it was unhurried and certain. The kind of kiss that does not feel like a beginning because it feels like a truth that has always been there, waiting to be stated plainly. When they separated, she kept her hand against his face for a moment longer, and her expression was the most unguarded he had ever seen it. Open and a little wondering, as if she had not entirely anticipated what the truth, when stated plainly, would actually feel like. "Well," she said. "Well," he agreed. She laughed, which was a sound he had heard only twice before, brief and bright and genuine, and it was the best thing he had heard in a very long time. The following weeks were the most remarkable of Lionel Abbott's life, and he had spent considerable time in remarkable circumstances. Cook filed an appeal with the district court, as expected. Whitfield prepared the response. The legal machinery ground on. But meanwhile, on the Townsend ranch in the golden fall of 1882, something remarkable was growing between two people who had both spent years in the particular loneliness of self-sufficiency. and were discovering, with some surprise and a great deal of pleasure, that company, the right company, was an extraordinary thing. He taught her to read tracks in the soft earth of the creek bank, because she had always been curious about it and had never had anyone patient enough to teach her properly. She taught him the particular management of the cattle herd that her father had developed over 2 decades, the individual idiosyncrasies of the animals, which ones were leaders and which were followers, and how to read the herd's collective mood. He told her stories of the trail from his cattle driving years and made her laugh with the particular absurdity of that life, and she told him stories of her childhood on the ranch that made him feel the shape of the man her father had been and grieve a little on her behalf for the size of the loss. They disagreed sometimes. Beatrice had opinions that were firm and well-reasoned, and she expressed them without apology. And Lionel was not a man who agreed simply to maintain peace. So there were arguments, real ones about practical matters and about larger ones. After the first truly sharp disagreement, about whether to sell a portion of the cattle to bolster the cash position, she had said to him with considerable heat that she found him infuriating, and he had said that he found her equally so, and they had stared at each other for a charged moment, and then both started talking at the same time, and then both stopped, and something about the mutual frustration was so recognizable and so fundamentally them that the edge went out of it. And they had found a compromise by supper that was actually better than either of their original positions. He loved her. He did not say it immediately, because it was not the kind of thing he said carelessly, and he wanted to be certain that what he was feeling was the thing it appeared to be and not something simple or misidentified. But he knew. He had known since the kitchen with the salt and the brush of hands, or perhaps since the boardwalk in August, or perhaps since the saloon when he had watched her walk in and say what needed saying and walk out again with her spine straight. He told her on a November evening when the first cold had come in, and they were sitting on the porch in the late afternoon, watching the sunset turn the flat Texas landscape into something impossibly beautiful, amber and rose and deep purple at the horizon's edge. "I love you," he said, simply and directly, because she had taught him that was the right way to say important things. She turned and looked at him, and her face did the thing that it always did at the most important moments, which was to become perfectly still and completely open at the same time. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time." "And," he said. "And I love you," she said. Which is a thing I did not expect to be saying to a former deputy marshal who turned up at my father's gate uninvited in August. "Life is full of surprises," he said. "It is," she agreed. "I find I am not as opposed to surprises as I once was." He took her hand and she let him, and they watched the rest of the sunset together. Cook's appeal moved through the district court slowly, as such things did, and in December it was denied. Whitfield conveyed the news with the restrained satisfaction of a man who has been right about something important, and Beatrice received it with a nod and a deep breath that she let out over what felt like several seconds. But Cook was not finished. He was a man who had built his fortune through persistence and the willingness to find angles that others did not think to look for, and the legal path having closed, he began looking for other angles. What he found was Lionel's past in New Mexico. He found it in the form of a former territorial deputy from Tres Rios named Cage, who arrived in Caldwell Creek in December with a version of the events there that was, as Lionel had feared, reframed into something that could be used against him. In Cage's version, the confrontation between Lionel and Marshal Vance had been unprovoked, the result of a personal grudge, and Lionel had left the territory under something approaching a formal accusation of misconduct. None of that was accurate. But Cage brought a signed affidavit from a New Mexico justice of the peace, and Cook's attorney Pryor presented it to the county council, with the suggestion that a man of this character had no business operating as a private security presence on contested property, and that his testimony and involvement in the Townsend matter should be reviewed. Lionel was at the county council meeting, which was open to the public, and he heard every word. He sat through it without reaction, which took considerably more effort than his expression showed. On the walk back to where Samuel was tied, Beatrice walked beside him in silence. "Tell me what you're thinking," he said. "I am thinking," she said carefully, "that Cage is lying, that Cook paid him to come here, and that the council will likely do nothing because the affidavit is signed by a New Mexico official, and they have no way to easily verify the contrary." "That is exactly correct." "I am also thinking," she said, "that none of it changes anything, not for me." He stopped walking and looked at her. "You were going to ask if I believed them," she said. "You were going to give me the chance to doubt you." "It occurred to me," he said. "Then I want to be very clear," she said. "I have listened to you for 3.5 months. I have watched you make decisions under pressure when it would have been easier and safer to make other decisions. I know who you are. Cook can send 100 men with signed papers, and what I know about you will not change." He did not say anything for a moment because he was not certain his voice would be entirely steady. "You are the most remarkable person I have ever met," he said. "I know," she said, and the tiniest ghost of a smile moved at the corner of her mouth. They wrote to the territorial court in New Mexico and requested the official record of the Tres Rios matter. Whitfield sent a formal inquiry through proper legal channels. 2 weeks later, a letter came back from the territorial court, confirming that Marshal Darrell Vance had been tried and convicted of cattle theft and abuse of official position, and that former Deputy Lionel Abbott had been a key witness for the prosecution and was cleared of any impropriety. Whitfield presented this at a second county council meeting, and the matter was closed. Cage was gone from Caldwell Creek the same day the letter arrived, which suggested he had been watching the situation closely and had judged the timing correctly. Cook did not appear at the council meeting. His attorney Pryor did, and the expression on Pryor's face when the letter was read aloud was that of a man recalculating his professional associations. After the meeting, Whitfield shook both their hands. "I believe," he said with the understated precision of a Texas attorney, "that Randall Cook has run out of viable avenues." "He will not accept that gracefully," Beatrice said. "No," Whitfield said. "But a man who has run out of viable avenues and knows it often makes his final move out of anger rather than strategy, and angry men are considerably less dangerous than strategic ones." Whitfield was right. Cook's final move came on a cold evening in early January, 1883. Lionel was in the stable doing the last of the evening rounds when he heard hooves on the road, multiple horses moving at a pace that was not casual. He came out of the stable into the yard and saw 3 riders coming through the gate, which he had not been at because it was late, and he had not expected company. They were Cook's outriders, the same 2 he had seen before with a third he did not recognize. They came into the yard at a walk and stopped, and the one in the center said, "Cook wants to see you, both of you." "Cook can come here himself," Lionel said. "He's at the Four Corners Saloon," the rider said. "He says he wants to settle this tonight. He has a final offer." Lionel looked at the riders for a long moment. He heard the door of the house open and Beatrice came down the porch steps to stand beside him, which told him she had heard the horses from inside. "What kind of offer?" she said. "He'll pay the full assessed value of the property," the rider said. $12,000, cash, tonight. He says you can take it or you can keep fighting, and he will find another way to make this difficult. The riders had the particular still quality of men who were aware that a gun was accessible, and Lionel had long ago developed the instinct that told him when outriders were there for pressure rather than for violence. These were pressure men. They would not draw on their own initiative. "Tell Cook," Beatrice said, in a voice that was entirely clear and carried no uncertainty at all, "that this land is not for sale. It was not for sale when my father was alive, and it is not for sale now. The legal matter has been settled by the courts and there is nothing to discuss. If he has a final offer, he can write it to Mr. Whitfield and I will have it formally declined in writing." The rider looked at her for a moment, then he looked at Lionel. Lionel looked back without expression. The riders left. Beatrice stood in the cold yard and watched them go. Lionel stood beside her. When they were gone, she let out a breath that was visible in the cold air as a small cloud. "He is not going to stop," she said. "No," Lionel said, "but he is getting smaller in his moves." That offer was not a powerful man's move. That was a man running out of cards. She turned and looked at him in the pale January moonlight. "How long do you think it takes before a man like that simply accepts a loss?" "In my experience," Lionel said, "men like Cook don't typically accept losses, they redirect. He'll find another piece of land to pursue, another leverage position somewhere else. We are simply going to cease to be the most useful thing to chase." "You make it sound almost calm," she said. "It may not be calm," he admitted. "There may be more trouble before there is less, but the fundamental position is ours." She nodded slowly. Then she said, "Come inside. It is too cold to stand out here and contemplate Randall Cook." "An excellent point," he said. They went in, and she made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table as they had on so many evenings now. And the kitchen was warm and smelled of the pine logs burning in the stove, and outside the wind came up from the south and moved through the cottonwoods with a sound like distant water. "I want to ask you something," she said. "Ask." She wrapped both hands around her cup and looked at him across the table with the direct, considering gaze that he had come to understand was her most genuine expression. "What do you want this to be, properly, you and I in this place?" He had thought about this. He had thought about it considerably. "I want to help you build this ranch into what your father intended it to be," he said. "I want to help you fight for the water rights of the families your father protected, because that fight is not over either and it is worth fighting. I want to wake up in the morning on this land and know that I am where I am supposed to be." He paused. "And I want you to marry me, Beatrice, if you are willing." The silence that followed was the longest kind, the kind that contains a great deal. "You are asking me properly," she said, as if confirming something she was somewhat astonished by. "It is a proper thing to ask," he said. "And I am asking now rather than waiting for circumstances to be more settled, because I have waited for circumstances to be settled my whole life, and I have learned that settled circumstances are not a thing that can be waited for." She looked at him. Her expression was doing its complicated, layered thing, the thing where everything she felt moved across it in sequence if you knew how to read it, and he knew how to read it. He saw the surprise and the wanting and the fear, a small and reasonable fear, and he saw it overcome by something larger and more certain. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Reached across the table and took her hand, and she held it firmly and immediately as she did everything. "There is one condition," she said. "Name it." "This will be a partnership," she said. "This ranch will be ours, not yours that I manage from the side. I will have an equal voice in all decisions." "I would have it no other way," he said. "Your judgment is better than mine on most things, and I have enough self-knowledge to admit it." She laughed, and it was the full version of the laugh, unguarded and warm. "You are the most unusual man I have ever known," she said. "You said that before," he said. "It keeps being true," she said. They were married in February of 1883, on a cold, clear Saturday morning at the church in Caldwell Creek, with James Whitfield and his wife as witnesses, and the pastor of the Methodist church presiding because Beatrice had known him since childhood and trusted him, which was the most important criterion. The ceremony was simple and honest, which suited both of them perfectly. Beatrice wore her mother's dress, let out and altered in the weeks before, a cream-colored satin with long sleeves against the February cold, and she walked into the church on her own because there was no one left to walk her in, and she walked with her head up and her spine straight as she always did. Lionel stood at the front of the church and watched her walk toward him and felt something so large it was essentially impossible to name. She reached him and took his hands and looked at him. "You're not going to bolt," she said quietly, for his ears only, teasing him with the seriousness of a woman who did not tease often. "Not in 1,000 years," he said, equally quietly. They made their vows. They meant every word. The Whitfields wept with appropriate discretion. Spring came to the Townsend ranch. which was now by all accounts also the Abbott Ranch, though Beatrice kept Townsend in its name because Gerald Townsend had earned that, and Lionel agreed without hesitation. The cattle survived the winter, and several new calves arrived in March and April, which was a good sign. They planted a kitchen garden behind the house that was more productive than the one Beatrice had maintained alone, because Lionel had his mother's Kentucky knowledge of soil and growing things, a knowledge he had not used in years and found, to his mild surprise, that he had missed. Cook made one more attempt in March, a legal letter through Pryor claiming some obscure easement right over the south pasture. Whitfield dispatched it in a week with a citation that made Pryor's argument look embarrassingly thin. They did not hear from Cook again for a long time after that. The Cimarron family came to visit in April, having heard that the Townsend Ranch had held against Cook, which had evidently become something of a local story. Felipe Cimarron, who was the patriarch of the family, was a man in his late 60s with the bearing of someone who had been fighting for his family's rights longer than either Lionel or Beatrice had been alive. He shook Lionel's hand and then, after a moment of assessment, clapped him on the shoulder. He told Beatrice that her father had been the best neighbor a family could have, and that he was glad to see the land in hands that would honor his memory. Beatrice managed to hold herself together through the visit, and after the Cimarron family left, she went and stood in the kitchen garden for a while by herself, and Lionel saw her from the window and left her to it because he knew that was what she needed. Later, when she came in, he simply poured 2 cups of coffee and set one in front of her, and that was all that needed to be done. Summer of 1883 was good to them. The cattle herd grew. Lionel rode to San Antonio in July and established a relationship with Emmett Voss that resulted in a fall drive that brought genuine money for the first time in years. It was not wealth, but it was security, and it allowed them to retire the last of Gerald Townsend's debt well ahead of schedule, which Beatrice marked with the most practical and characteristic celebration possible, which was to write out the paid notice herself and frame it on the kitchen wall where she could see it every morning. In the evenings, they sat on the porch and watched the summer stars come out over the flat Texas land, and they talked about everything and nothing, the way people do when conversation is not a performance but a comfort, and they were at peace in a way that neither of them had been before, not because all difficulty was gone, but because they were no longer facing it alone. It was on one of those evenings in late August, the first anniversary of the day Lionel had ridden into Caldwell Creek, that Beatrice said something that made him put down his coffee cup and look at her. "I believe we are going to have company," she said, in a perfectly measured tone. It took him a moment to understand what she meant. When he understood, he looked at her face, and the expression there was complicated and extraordinary, a mixture of joy and terror and wonder that was unlike any expression he had seen on her before. "Beatrice," he said. "In the spring," she said. "Approximately." He crossed the porch in 2 steps and took her face in his hands and looked at her, and what he felt in that moment was something beyond the capacity of language to entirely carry, but he tried anyway. "I love you," he said. "I love you completely and without reservation, and whatever comes next, we will manage it." "I know we will," she said, and she was smiling now, fully and without the small, careful movements of her usual near smiles, a full and genuine and slightly disbelieving smile. "We are remarkably good at managing things." "We are," he agreed. He pulled her close, and she leaned into him in the Texas summer evening, and the stars came out one by one over the Townsend Abbott Ranch, and the cottonwoods moved softly in the warm air, and somewhere in the pasture one of the cattle lowed and was answered by another, and the world was full of ordinary, extraordinary sound. The baby came in April of 1884, on a Thursday morning when the peach trees along the south fence were blooming for the first time in 3 years. Lionel had ridden for the doctor and ridden back so fast that Samuel was thoroughly winded and deeply offended, and by the time the doctor arrived, Beatrice had already determined that things were progressing efficiently and had communicated this to Mrs. Whitfield, who had come to help, with the calm of a woman who had read everything available on the subject and found very little in the actual event that surprised her. The baby was a boy, born at 10:30 in the morning, with his father's dark eyes and his mother's decisive expression, announcing himself with a clarity of lung that made the doctor nod approvingly. They named him Gerald Lionel Abbott, for the grandfather he would never meet and the father who would spend the rest of his life trying to be worthy of him. When Lionel first held him, he did not say anything for a long time. He stood in the bedroom in the April morning light with this small and extraordinary person in his arms, and something settled inside him that he had not known was unsettled, some last residue of the years of moving and uncertainty and the long accumulation of things gone wrong. Beatrice watched him from the bed with her amber eyes, tired and luminous. "Well," she said. "Gerald Lionel Abbott," he said. "He is perfect." "He is," she agreed. "And he is very loud." "He gets that from you," Lionel said. She threw a pillow at him, which given her recent exertion was impressive. The boy grew. He grew in the way that children on ranches grow, into early wakefulness and outdoor capability, and a directness of personality that was clearly inherited from both parents in concentrated form. By the time he was old enough to walk, he was following his father around the property with the solemn attention of someone taking detailed notes, and he was following his mother around the kitchen with the same attention, because early on Gerald had determined that both parents knew useful and different things, and he intended to learn all of them. Randall Cook, it eventually became known, had overextended himself in a land acquisition scheme in 1884 that went badly when the railroad changed its route, and the land he had bought anticipating a station became worth very little. He sold off holdings, including several properties in the county adjacent to Caldwell Creek, and by 1885 he was a significantly reduced figure in the region. His name still carried weight, but the particular menacing quality it had once held had diminished considerably. The last Lionel heard of him directly was a letter from Whitfield in the spring of 1886, noting that Cook had sold the Double C operation and relocated to Houston. Whitfield communicated this with the same careful restraint he brought to all communications, though Lionel detected something very close to satisfaction in the phrasing. He showed the letter to Beatrice at breakfast. She read it, set it down, and poured herself more coffee. "Good," she said. "That's all," he said. "What else is there to say?" she said. "He is gone. The ranch is ours. We have a great deal of work to do today." He looked at her across the table, over the coffee cups and Gerald's half-eaten biscuit, and the morning light coming through the kitchen window, and he thought about August of 1882 and a woman who had walked into a saloon and said what needed saying. He thought about a boardwalk and a brown gelding named Samuel and $11 in his pocket and no particular destination. "I love you," he said. She looked at him with the direct amber gaze. "I know you do," she said. "I love you too. Now eat your breakfast. We have cattle to move before noon." "Yes, ma'am," he said. And the kitchen was warm, and outside the Texas morning was clear and cool, and their son was eating his biscuit with great concentration, and the ranch was theirs, properly and legally and entirely, and Lionel Abbott, who had spent the better part of his adult life going where the work was, had finally found the place where all the work was worthwhile. There would be more seasons. The summer of 1886 brought a drought that tested them, and they met it with the pooled knowledge of a cattle rancher's daughter and a man who had ridden through more dry country than most, and they lost fewer animals than their neighbors and helped the Cimarron family get through it with their water rights intact. The following winter was mild, which balanced the accounting. In 1887, a second child came, a daughter this time, whom they named Martha for Beatrice's mother, and she had her grandmother's name and her father's stubbornness and her mother's intelligence, and she was from her first weeks something altogether formidable. Gerald, who was 3 years old when Martha arrived, regarded her with the uncertain interest of a firstborn encountering a rival, and then with increasing protectiveness as he determined that she was quite small and the world was quite large, and he was in a position to be useful. It was a dynamic that suited both their personalities remarkably well. Lionel taught his son to read tracks when Gerald was old enough to follow the lesson, sitting with him in the soft earth near the creek bank, the way Beatrice had once sat with him. He taught him to ride, and to care for the horses properly, and to treat the land with the attention it deserved. He taught him, in the particular way that fathers teach without quite naming what they are teaching, how to be honest and how to be fair, and how to stand up at a gate when someone needs you to stand up at a gate. Beatrice taught both children everything she knew about the cattle, and about the land, and about the proper use of their voices when something important needed to be said. She taught them about the Cimarron family and the water rights, and why that history mattered. She taught them that the law was a tool, and like all tools it could be used well or poorly, and that it was worth learning how it worked so that it could be used well. They were, by any honest accounting, happy. Not the uncomplicated happiness of people who have never suffered, which is a thin kind of happiness that does not hold up to weather, but the deeper kind, the kind that knows exactly what it cost and values it accordingly. On an October evening in 1887, 5 years after a rider had come down the road with a legal document and a smirk, and been told to turn his horse around, Lionel stood at the gate of his property and watched the sun go down over the flat amber land, and thought about the things that had happened, and the things that had almost happened, and the extraordinary contingency of where he had ended up. Beatrice came out of the house and across the yard, walking with the same straight spine she always had, wiping her hands on a cloth, her hair pinned up under the old wide-brimmed hat that had survived 5 Texas summers with him. She came to stand beside him at the gate and looked out at the same sunset. "Gerald has decided he wants to be a lawyer," she said. "He's 4 years old," Lionel said. "He is very advanced," she said. "He has a remarkable mother." "And a remarkable father," she said. She leaned against the gate post and looked at him with those amber eyes in the October light, and the love in her face was direct and clear and entirely unguarded, the way she had learned to let it be. He put his arm around her, and she leaned against him, and they watched the sun touch the horizon and the sky go rose and gold and deep violet, and the cottonwoods turned their last few autumn leaves in the evening wind, and behind them the house was lit with lamplight and the sound of their children moving through it, and the cattle were settled in the pasture, and the ranch was sound, and the debt was paid, and Randall Cook was in Houston and getting smaller with distance and time. There was a gate, and there was a man who had stood at it once because it was the right thing to do, and there was a woman who had accepted the help because she knew what it was and what it was not, and what had grown from that exchange between 2 honest people in a dry August afternoon was something that would outlast all the pressure and the dark past and the hidden motives and the forced choices that had tried to stop it. It was not a small or incidental thing. It was the whole of it. It was everything. "Come inside," Beatrice said. "Supper is ready." "I'll be right in," he said. She went back up the path, and he stood at the gate a moment longer, looking out at the last of the sunset and the wide dark edge of the Texas horizon, feeling the October wind and the weight of everything good, and then he turned and walked up the path to the house where the light was warm in all the windows, and went inside.